The BBC TV series Who Do You Think You Are has managed to do for many of us the impossible. It's managed to make genealogies, family trees, birth, wedding and death certificates actually exciting. If you're familiar with the program, then you will know how it works. Someone famous traces their family history, their family tree. They uncover in the process some surprising facts about who they are from the contents of dusty archives and ancient record books. Famously, Jeremy Paxman, the grumpy Grand Inquisitor of BBC News, was reduced to tears a few years ago in front of the cameras as he discovered the life of poverty and suffering which his great-grandmother endured in a Glasgow tenement at the turn of the last century. Who do you think you are? The compelling power of the program lies in the way that it captures the deep need within the human heart to understand ourselves as part of a bigger story, to appreciate the unique heritage that has made us. You see, everyone has a past. Sometimes that past is filled with brokenness as well as glory. And we all need to understand and to some extent own the past, to recognize how it's contributed to the present, though has not determined the present. For we can each become part of a future story, making choices, investing our time in the writing of new chapters. But what has a BBC TV program got to do with chapter 7 of the 5th century BC text of Nehemiah? Well, because this chapter is all about family trees and dusty archives and lists of names that tell stories about people with a past who are struggling to find a future. Where are we in the timeline? Look at verse 1 of chapter 7. The great building project in Jerusalem is now complete. It's over. The first verse says that. After the wall had been rebuilt, and I had set the doors in place. It's taken Nehemiah 52 days, remember, remarkably. In 52 days, Nehemiah did for the walls of Jerusalem what all the king's horses and all the king's men never did for Humpty Dumpty. He put the walls of Jerusalem back together again. Good news. Yeah, good news. But there's a problem. The rebuilding of the walls was just the beginning. Now comes the tough part, turning a crowd into a community. Do you see how the penny drops for Nehemiah in verse 4 of our passage? Now the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. Nehemiah is not just an action man. He's also deeply reflective. He has a vision much bigger than the restoration of those city walls. He sees further than the physical outcome. He is driven not just by design details and site meetings, but by the promptings of God in his soul. What do I mean? Well, read verse 5. So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families. For 52 days, Nehemiah, along with others, has been doing God's work. But he will not let that be at the expense of God's work in him. So in the middle of this crazy busyness, he notes in his memoir, so my God put it into my heart. Do you know, that is always something to watch out for in our Christianity and in our church life. We can be so busy doing the work of God, running this ministry, serving on that part of the wall, organizing this rota, that we neglect God's work in us, the heart. The heart, which needs to be open to God's Spirit and what he's saying to us, even in the pressures and the routines of life. And what does God put into Nehemiah's heart? Well, this passion to turn a crowd into a community, to gather the people together in a great formal assembly. We'll see that happen next week in chapter 8. It is the spiritual high point of the book, full of powerful emotion as the people rededicate themselves as well as the city to God. So this apparently unpromising chapter 7, which on the surface is as exciting to read as a telephone directory, it all sets up chapter 8 for us. But it's more than a scene setter, for this is a chapter about how we can find a sense of meaning and belonging. Let's see how Nehemiah answers the question. Who do you think you are? Firstly, in 1 to 3, the importance of the right people. First, Nehemiah tackles the task of safeguarding Israel's worship. In verse 1, very obvious, very prominent. That's what the gatekeepers and singers and Levites of verse 1 are assigned to do, to help the priests in their duties. Notice, when you've got time later on today and you read the whole chapter, notice how many verses in that chapter are devoted to the worship of the temple and the staffing and the organization of all that goes on there. There's a long list from verse 39 through to verse 65 of people, of those involved in the temple. The total figure of all the exiles who returned to Jerusalem from captivity is numbered in our chapter at 42,360. But of that total, nearly a tenth of those were involved directly in running temple worship. The temple gatekeepers are mentioned no less than 16 times in Nehemiah and in his companion and colleague's book, Ezra. What was it the psalmist says? I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord than dwell in the tents of wickedness. Better one day in your courts than 1,000 anywhere else. Now, why that priority on the temple in Israel's life? Why does Nehemiah begin with this perspective? Well, broadly, because we are made for worship. To be human is to be designed to worship the God who has created us for relationship with him. And so before anything else, Nehemiah safeguards Israel's worship. That's the priority, for this is the main purpose of Israel's life, to be a worshiping community. This great enterprise of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and the city itself, that great enterprise has at its heart the honor of God, the exalting of God's majesty, and the proclaiming of his name among the nations. And any church worthy of the name must see itself primarily as the gathering of worshippers whose purpose is to lift the truth of God's unique glory high. Our exciting regeneration project, of which we are all going to be a part, to build on this site a new contemporary church facility, that exciting project has at its greatest ambition to secure the worship of God for the coming generations. That's what it's about. We are not trying to build a social center or a recreational space or an educational complex, though those functions will go on in various parts of the new premises as we seek to engage with the locality and the wider society. But our primary vision is to gather a community of worshipers connected to God in prayer and praise and proclamation. That does not mean that we are looking to design a temple in the sense that Israel was going to do here. Worship of God is not confined anymore to places like the temple in Jerusalem or like this. There is no temple now, of course. It was destroyed in AD 72. And the coming of Jesus has brought God to us personally. And the coming of God's Spirit brings God within us. so that we now are temples of the living God. But there is still a royal priesthood. That's us, the living church. And God is still to be praised in joyful assembly among us. And his truth is still to be proclaimed as his people gather to hear his word and respond in lives of sacrifice and service. The great quest for LBC in the next 3 years is not merely to construct a building so much as to create a congregation, a community of people who are connecting to God and living for God and going into their week fired by God's Spirit. That's why we must be concerned, like Nehemiah, to appoint the right people to the temple, to the roles of ministry and service. We need the gatekeepers and the Levites and the priests and the singers. And by the way, there are 245 of them mentioned in verse 67 of our chapter. So Duncan Tuffrey and Anne Savage, we expect 245. No, seriously, those who make music, those who preach and teach, those who pastor, those who lead. That is to be a primary responsibility as we move forward. And one of the main objectives in the next few years is therefore to build a great staff team who can help us serve the vision of the church. And what's that vision? Let me repeat it in case anyone misunderstands. What's the vision of Lansdowne in the future? We want to be a community connected upwards to God in vibrant worship, inwards to each other in loving care, and outwards to the society and world in mission. If you want it simply, up, in, and out. Got it? That's the vision. Up to God in worship, in towards each other in love and sacrifice and care, and out to a world of need in mission. That's the vision. Up, in, and out. So, safeguarding Israel's worship was the main item on the agenda to begin with for Nehemiah. Secondly, securing Jerusalem's defenses. According to verse 2, Hanani, that is Nehemiah's brother, the man who first brought him the news of Jerusalem's condition, and Hananiah, the garrison commander, they are put in charge. Now look at what's said about Hananiah. He may have been a 5-star military general, but the stated reason he was selected for the task is, look, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most men do. In other words, character was the key virtue on his CV. And when we, Lansdowne, look to appoint to office in the life of the church people, whether as staff or leaders or volunteer helpers, of course there needs to be a level of competence, the skill sets to do the job well. But by far the most significant quality is integrity. Character. Peter Kuzmic, a former leader of Christian work in Yugoslavia, commented, charisma without character leads to catastrophe. It's true. So in our securing of and safeguarding of our worship and in securing of our defenses, we need to appoint people to office of integrity who fear God. Let's move on from the importance of the right people to the significance of history. Here we run from verse 4 right through to verse 69, so hold on to your hats. Nehemiah finds the genealogical record of all the families who were the first generation that came back to Judah after the exile in Babylon. He finds the archives. And so that list begins in verse 6 with Zerubbabel, and it finishes in verse 69 with an inventory of how many camels came back, and donkeys, and choir members, 247 of them, making the long journey home. Now, why was Nehemiah keen to uncover history? Firstly, because it proves legitimacy. It proves who has the legal right to take up residence in Judah and in Jerusalem. People's claim to land had to be proved, so their family history had to be traced to establish entitlements. We know, don't we, in our world today, that land rights are very sensitive issues. And especially here, after so many years of dislocation and change and the passing of generations. That's why towards the end of the chapter, in verse 61 and then in verse 64, we read these unusual comments, I suppose. The following came up from the towns of Tel Mahar, Tel Harashah, Kerub, Adon, and Immer, but they could not show that their families were descended from Israel. And then verse 64. But they could not find them, that is, the family records they searched for, so they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. If you examine closely the place names amongst those verses and the family names recorded, you can see how varied and how wide the tribal backgrounds, how scattered and far apart from their hometowns had they all been. If you think that LBC is made up of many tribes who travel distances across the conurbation to be here, then get a handle on the map of the exiles. Firstly, then, it establishes or proves legitimacy. Secondly, it establishes identity. Who do you think you are? Several generations, remember, had come and gone since Nebuchadnezzar had ransacked Jerusalem and taken God's people captive. Here were their predecessors. And now, 150 years later, coming home, they needed to be assured that this generation belonged. They needed to know who their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents were and what had happened to them. Like baby Alyssa, who her parents and her grandparents and her great-grandparents are. These people in Jerusalem needed to know that their past had not been taken from them and that they had a future that was secure. It must have been very moving for Nehemiah as he made his way through these family records to see the evidence of those first families who took the gamble of coming back to their places of birth from Babylon to start again. Each name representing a journey, a risk. But they responded to the call of home. Let me teach you a bit of Welsh this morning. There's a beautiful word in Welsh, which, like many Welsh words, is difficult to say and almost impossible to spell. It's the word hiraeth. There's no direct translation into English, but it's a word for the tug of your homeland on your heart. It's more than homesickness. Hiraeth is the bond you have with a place and a people. It's where you belong. In one of my mission trips during the 1990s, I spent some time among the Luchazi people. They are camped now, as they were then, outside the city limits of Windhoek in Namibia, many of them living in poverty. The Luchazi were not originally from the capital, Windhoek. Like so many African tribal groups, they are a displaced community driven from the north of Namibia near the Angolan border because of the war there. And as I sat among them for worship on a Sunday, many of their songs were about their sense of rootlessness and longing to go home. Hiraeth. Listen in. Over the next few years, in all the busyness of our growing and changing as a church, of the movement of new people in amongst us and joining us, and of the many significant changes which our regeneration project will bring. In all of that, please, we must not forget how important a sense of belonging and continuity is to us. The impact of those changes coming up now probably sooner than we realize. The impact of those changes on those of you who have been around Lansdowne for years, who have sat in the pews, maybe the same pews, for the last 25 years. It is going to be different. And we want to make sure that together we know who we are. You see, we won't have this building in 18 months' time. We will be in exile, not 70 years of exile, I hope, like the Israelites. Please, Keith and Ian, promise me that. But it will feel a little rootless. Things won't be in the same place. We won't know where to put the flowers on a Sunday morning, at least not initially. Where's the piano going to go? And all of that. And in the upheaval, we are each going to need to know that we still belong to family, that we have our place in the scheme of things, and that this great journey out of here for 18 months somewhere in the wilderness of the conurbation will bring us back home eventually. You see, roots require history, shared stories, lines of connection. We need to know our 137-year history as a church in that sense. We need to know where we have come from, how the past has shaped us. And while the job of people like me and the leadership is to articulate vision, to plant a flag in the future and imagine what will be, it's also the job of people like me and our leadership to help create a sense of identity, of belonging, of bringing people into the family so that together we are not passing traffic, but permanent residents. And that those who've joined LBC in recent months will need to feel, just as much as those of you who have been here for generations, that same sense of legitimacy and identity. For thirdly, this creates community. That's what Nehemiah was after, community. And that community, as we've seen, has leaders and people who cast vision, like him, those who establish cohesion and strategic direction. Without leaders, a community will go round and round in circles. Israel's leaders get a mention in verse 7. First, there's Zerubbabel. His is a Persian name because Zerubbabel was born in exile. It means offspring of Babylon. He is the grandson of King Jehoiakim, the last but one king of Judah who'd been captured and chained by Nebuchadnezzar. Next in the list of verse 7 is Jeshua, the high priest. It was the policy, you see, of the Babylonians to deport the leaders and the intellectuals of the countries they conquered. And from verse 8 of the chapter, we get those lists of Israelites mentioned in family groups, the thousands of homecomers. And they're not lumped together in one mass, but they're organized and related to their local and family circles. These are real people, in other words, with real names. Some of those names are highly amusing. Take the first on the list at verse 8. The descendants of Parosh, 2,172 of them. Now, Parosh means flee. Israelites were often named, you see, after insects or animals. So there were 2,172 fleas jumping around Judah. That Luchazi congregation in Windhoek, Namibia, I mentioned before, they had a pastor. His name was Everest Soap. Apparently, from the time that he moved down from the north with his congregation, he carried with him a bar of soap, of which the trade name was Everest. And so they called him Pastor Soap, Pastor Everest Soap. In Pakistan, I met a man named Lazarus. And when I asked why he was called Lazarus, but that's another story. You can probably work it out. One other amusing name I discovered in my research in the study this week through these archives. It appears in verse 53. He's there among the list of temple servants. Backbook. Backbook literally means jar. It's a nickname for a fat man with a protruding belly. Backbook. Now, why do I mention these silly things? For this reason. Every community is made up of individuals, real people with real names and stories to tell. Now, we may not have many fleas in LBC, many paroshes or Lazaruses. We have possibly a few back books, I imagine. But we will have the equivalent. Real people with real names and real stories. And every name matters, because every story builds a community with history and identity. We are not clones of each other. We're all one-offs in every case. I have never met an ordinary person in my life. Everyone is extraordinary. Everyone is a snowflake. No two of us are alike. We each have significance. Every name, then, you see, tells the story. So in the constant challenge that we face as a church on the brink of a great adventure of building and growing, do not forget the faces and try to remember the names. The names of newcomers, the names of old-timers, the names of our children and our families, those who sit upstairs and those who sit downstairs. Let's know each other, meet the family, go find a parosh or a back book. People, but also places. From verse 26 to 38, people are classified by location, emphasizing what a mix of backgrounds there would have been. From verse 37, of Lod, Hadid, and Ono, 721. There's a great place to be born. Where were you born? Oh, I've come from Ono. And Sennar. By far the largest cohort came from Sennar. Those were low-caste people, we've discovered. At verse 39, the community is described at another level. People, places, now roles and responsibilities. The priests in 39 to 42, the gatekeepers and Levites, and temple servants in 43 to 56. And some of those are interesting non-Jewish names, like our friend, Fat Belly Backbook. You know, I've worshipped and I've served in 8 different congregations in my life for different decent periods of time. And I tell you, there is nothing like the society of the church. We are a wonderfully colorful and rich community. The people of God, when they are properly led and rightly placed and well connected, there is nothing like the family of the church on earth. Okay, the last point quickly, the right response. From verse 70 to 73, finally, here comes John Adams and the treasurer's report. You see, no enterprise can be without the treasurer or the financial costs. And so we have them from verse 70. Someone crunches the numbers. So Nehemiah chooses to record the financial response of the community to the development project in Jerusalem. The Bible is never squeamish or embarrassed about money and earthly possessions. It has a very healthy attitude to that subject. Nehemiah stands in that great biblical tradition which says that everything we have comes from God and is to be used for the glory of God. And that is what the restored community in Jerusalem realized. They understand that if this city was to be rebuilt, then money was needed. So they gave personally. Verse 70, some of the heads of the families contributed to the work. The governor gave to the treasury 1,000 drachmas of gold, 50 bowls, and 530 garments for the priests, and so on and so on. The leaders took ownership of the project. A healthy sign in any true work of God is when people give freely and willingly to it. Not because they have to, but because they want to. It seems to me that at the heart of our financial response to the building project here during the last month, that's been the heart attitude, one of free, glad giving. You see, behind the headline figures of 2.33 million on the gift and pledge day itself is, we know, a lot of sacrifice, but also a lot of joy, a lot of hilarity. That's the meaning of the word which the Apostle Paul uses in his second letter to the church at Corinth to encourage them to give. The Lord, he says, the Lord loves an hilarious giver, a cheerful giver. And we've seen that, haven't we, in the last few weeks amongst us. The giving which God wants to see is giving with a broad smile, giving for the sheer joy and pleasure of it. Let me take you to that Luchazi congregation in Namibia one last time. They worship in a district called Katatura. And the children of the missionaries I was staying with called the church the Plastic Bag Church. That should tell you what the church was made up of. Yes, mainly black plastic bags tied between bits of corrugated roof. And there, the church structure was virtually crumbling. Pastor Everest Soap preached, and then it was time for the offering. And my colleague and friend turned to me and said, "Hey, don't give it all. Keep some back. You'll see why in a moment." And so the offering was taken up. But 20 minutes later, the bags went round the rows again for a second offering. And 20 minutes after that, a third. Only this time, the men and the women who brought the offering bags to the front were dancing and singing down the aisle. In the black plastic bag church, where poverty was so obvious, where the roof was falling in, these people knew the meaning of cheerful giving. The second feature of the response in Nehemiah's day was that the people gave generously. Not everyone gave, says the record, but those that did gave a lot. How do we know? Well, if you can do the maths, it'll help you. A shekel was equivalent to the average monthly wage, and there were 60 shekels in a mina. So, in the records there, 1 mina equaled 5 years' wages. And we are told that some of the heads of the families gave 2,200 silver minas. That was a lot of wealth. And then the chapter concludes. The priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the temple servants, along with certain of the people, and the rest of the Israelites, settled in their own homes. They came home. Here they were, the right people in the right place at the right time. Nehemiah was turning a crowd into a community, a people with a past, a present, but now a future, a people who had come home. It is the great purpose of God to bring a people together at the end of time, to call them home, a people who will worship him from every tribe and language and nation under heaven, a people who at the end of time will praise Christ and who will know themselves to be part of a great and glorious story, the story of great love, the story of great sacrifice. And the centerpiece of that story is the cross. And we're about now to share that communion time together as the family, knowing that our identity is in Christ, and that together as community we have a hope and a future, and we hear the call home, the call of heaven. That's what drives us forward. And when we realize how the story of God centers in the cross and death and resurrection of Jesus, our response, it demands my soul, my life, my all. Those are words from the hymn that we're going to sing together now. The great hymn of Isaac Watts. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour content on all my pride. So come now, find your identity here at the cross with other members of the family. Become part of the great, great story of God's grace and salvation. And with the hymn writer and the whole of nature, offer your life, your soul, your all to God. Let's stand and sing together.